What happened in Catalonia on Sunday was shaming and shocking in a modern European state. Spanish police bludgeoned and assaulted defenseless civilians who were simply trying to exercise their democratic right. First and foremost, this is a terrible crisis for the wrong-headed, bully-boy government in Madrid. After the unedifying spectacle of police attacking blameless voters, the chances must surely have increased of Catalonia, Spain's most prosperous region with some 7.5 million inhabitants, seceding. But it is also an enormous crisis for the European Union, which in recent weeks has said almost nothing as the Spanish authorities arrested officials arranging an independence referendum on behalf of the devolved Catalan government. While millions of European citizens were rubbing their eyes in disbelief at the state-inspired violence, the European Commission in the shape of Jean-Claude Juncker yesterday issued a short, bland statement reminding Catalans that if they left Spain they would also have to leave the EU. There were a few pious words about the inadvisability of violence. Otherwise a disgraceful silence has reigned. We may be pretty sure that if police in right-wing Hungary, an EU member, had battered protesters demonstrating on behalf of migrants, Juncker would have expressed his outrage at voluminous length. One reason he did not do so in the case of Spain is that it is one of the most obedient pro-EU countries in Europe, which seldom defies the will of Brussels, or causes trouble for Juncker and his ilk. But there is an even deeper reason for the Commission's silence. The events in Catalonia challenge at a deep level its project for ever closer union, about which both Juncker and President Emmanuel Macron of France have ventilated in recent weeks. For how can there be an amicable union between the EU's nation-states if some of those nations are themselves deeply divided and fractious, as is plainly the case with Catalonia and Spain? Here is a region of largely Catalan-speaking people who regard themselves as culturally distinct. A sizable proportion of them yearn to break free from Spain, even though Catalonia has been part of the country for hundreds of years. Sunday's vote illuminates a truth which Brussels cannot bear. There are many people in Europe for whom the atavistic call of identity counts far more than any exhortation about forging a European superstate. That, after all, was one of the main messages of Brexit, that the majority of voters in our own ancient nation resent the undemocratic control of Brussels, and have no wish to be sucked into a united Europe. For Brussels, the example of Britain was bad enough, and it has set about trying to punish us for having had the effrontery to want to leave. In a sense, the demonstration of Catalan nationalism is even more alarming to the federalists because this show of independence is happening inside one of the EU's nation-states. How is it possible, they wonder, for the pan-European project to proceed if some EU countries are in danger of fracturing? The terror in Brussels is that if Catalonia were allowed to break away, regions in other member states could follow suit. Instead of coalescing into an amorphous whole, some EU nations might fall apart. Belgium, whose capital, Brussels, is the seat of EU expansionism, is divided. The Flemish-speaking region of Flanders, which constitutes about 60% of the country's population, is at daggers drawn with the French-speaking minority. Many people in northern Italy long to be rid of the impoverished south, which is relatively unproductive and, in the view of northerners, consumes more than its fair share of government spending. The right-wing Northern League has campaigned with some success for independence for the north, and imagines a separate country called Padania. France faces an independence movement in the island of Corsica. Meanwhile, the cohesion of Spain is threatened not just by free-spirited Catalans but also by militant Basques, part of whose territory lies in France. Romania and Slovakia both have unhappy Hungarian minorities. Even in Poland's region of Silesia, much of which used to be ruled by Germany until 1945, there are stirrings of an independence movement. All over Europe, apparently unified countries are harried by breakaway groups which have a strong sense of separate identity. If Catalonia were allowed to go it alone, who knows what might come next? The problem for Brussels is that it is used to dealing with individual nation-states but is powerless to intervene in unruly regions. That is why the Commission has remained so quiet in the case of Catalonia, apart from expressing a few words of solidarity with Spain. By the way, the British response has been regrettably supine. Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson stressed his support for the Spanish government in a tweet. As the leading Brexiteer, he should surely have been more critical of Madrid's use of violence. The Spanish government, it must be said, has behaved rashly and brutishly. Arguably, some Catalan separatist political parties have been unwise in deliberately engineering a confrontation. But given that the Catalan government had made numerous requests to hold a referendum on independence, after Spain's constitutional court had controversially declared in 2010 that Catalonia was not a nation, what was it to do, having been rebuffed time and time again? If it had possessed a modicum of good sense, the Spanish government would have allowed the referendum to go ahead. Had the vote been in favor of independence, it could then have questioned its legal status. But to arrest Catalan officials, to close a large number of polling stations, and then to clobber innocent voters were acts of unbelievable stupidity as well as nastiness. It passes understanding how the Prime Minister of Spain, Mariano Rajoy, can say that democracy has prevailed. The opposite is true. Imagine if 2 or 3 years hence the Scottish National Party's Nicola Sturgeon were to hold a referendum without the approval of Westminster, by no means an unthinkable eventuality. In fact, her case would be much weaker than that of the Catalan government, since there has already been one legal referendum in Scotland in 2014, which was said by the SNP leader Alex Salmond at the time to be the last for a generation. Even so, it is inconceivable that a new unofficial referendum in Scotland would be met by the authorities in Westminster with police wielding batons and ring rubber bullets. Such a wild overreaction would inevitably give a boost to Scottish nationalism, as, I have no doubt, the cause of Catalan nationalism will have benefited from Sunday's onslaught. The truth is that the Spanish state has a very restricted conception of democracy. We should know that already from its desire to shoehorn Gibraltar into Spain despite 99% of its citizens having voted in a 2002 referendum to remain British. God alone knows what will happen now in Catalonia. Unless the Spanish government agrees to an official referendum, an unlikely prospect, there will probably be deadlock. I am afraid there is also the possibility of more violence on both sides. Justifying and supporting the Madrid government is the European Commission in all its absurdity, dreaming dreams of a union which the people of Europe do not want. It will do its utmost to ensure that Catalonia doesn't interfere with its grandiose scheme. Will Remainers look at Catalonia and reek that we have a quieter and more civilized way of dealing with our differences in this country? It don't know. What I do know is that every day I am ever more relieved that we are leaving this misguided club.